Right now, at this exact moment, Chinese naval vessels are repositioning through the Indian Ocean in a movement that Western intelligence agencies are tracking with growing alarm. Beijing is saying nothing, the Pentagon is saying very little, and the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow 21-mile choke point through which 20% of the world's oil supply travels every single day, sits at the end of that trajectory. What makes this development truly unprecedented is not just where these ships are going. It is what their presence would mean for every military calculation in the Middle East, for every alliance Washington has built over 5 decades, and for the global economy that depends on oil flowing freely through that narrow passage. Because this isn't just a naval deployment, this is China sending a message that could rewrite the rules of engagement in the most volatile region on Earth. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, and why the timing matters more than almost anyone in the mainstream media is telling you. The movement began in the South China Sea approximately 3 weeks ago, when satellite imagery analyzed by commercial intelligence firm Maxar Technologies, and subsequently confirmed by reporting from the Financial Times and Reuters, showed a reconfiguration of assets at China's Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island. Specifically, 2 Type 052D Luoyang 3 class guided missile destroyers, hull numbers 173 and 174, the Guiyang and the Zunyi, departed their moorings on a heading consistent with the Malacca Strait Transit Corridor. They were accompanied by a Type 054A Jiangkai 2 class frigate and, critically, a Type 903A replenishment vessel, the Dongpinghu, which provides the underway refueling and resupply capability that transforms a regional patrol into a true blue water deployment. This matters immediately for one specific reason. The presence of the Dongpinghu signals intent for extended operations far from Chinese home ports. You don't bring your gas station unless you plan to travel far. These vessels transited the Strait of Malacca on a course that took them through the Andaman Sea, then into the Bay of Bengal, where they conducted what Chinese state media, citing a People's Liberation Army Navy spokesman, described only as routine far sea training exercises. The Indian Navy's Eastern Naval Command tracked them throughout, according to reporting by The Hindu and confirmed by statements from India's Ministry of Defense. The formation then turned southwest, past Sri Lanka, and entered the northern Arabian Sea. At approximately 14:30 UTC, on the most recent confirmed tracking date, the group was positioned at roughly 20 degrees north, 65 degrees east, placing them approximately 900 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz and well within the operational envelope for a deliberate approach to the Gulf region. Here's what you need to understand about why that position is significant before we go any further into the strategic picture. 900 nautical miles at typical destroyer transit speed of 18 to 22 knots means this formation is between 40 and 50 hours from the Hormuz approach. That is not a coincidence of geography. That is a decision. Now let's talk about the hardware, because the specific capabilities these ships carry tell us everything about what China is prepared to do and prepared to threaten. The Type 052D Luoyang 3 destroyer is the backbone of China's modern surface combatant fleet, and it represents a genuine generational leap from anything Beijing could field a decade ago. Each vessel displaces approximately 7,500 tons at full load and carries 64 vertical launch system cells in a universal design directly inspired by, though not copied from, the American Mk-41 VLS architecture. What fills those cells is the critical question. The standard loadout for a Type 052D operating in a contested maritime environment typically includes a mix of the HHQ-9B surface-to-air missile, which has a maximum engagement range of 200 kilometers and is China's answer to the American SM-6 in the area denial role. It includes the YJ-18A anti-ship cruise missile, which operates in a 2-phase flight profile, a subsonic cruise phase out to approximately 220 kilometers, followed by a terminal supersonic sprint at Mach 2, 5 to 3, making it extraordinarily difficult to intercept in its final approach, and it includes the CJ-10 land attack cruise missile variant, with a reported range exceeding 1,500 kilometers and GPS plus terrain contour guidance, capable of hitting fixed targets with acceptable circular error probability. The Type 054A frigate accompanying this group adds YJ-83 anti-ship missiles with a range of approximately 180 kilometers, an HQ-16 medium-range SAM system for area air defense, and, critically, the hull-mounted SJD-9 active sonar combined with a towed array system that gives the formation genuine anti-submarine warfare capability. Let's put that capability package in context. The Strait of Hormuz is flanked on its northern shore by Iran, on its southern shore by the United Arab Emirates and Oman. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, maintains continuous presence in the Persian Gulf with a carrier strike group that typically includes a Nimitz or Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, and 3 to 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. The YJ-18A's 220-kilometer range, if launched from a position at the Hormuz approaches, puts vessels inside the Gulf itself within its engagement envelope. The CJ-10, with its 1,500-kilometer range, puts nearly every American installation in the region, including Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and the Fifth Fleet's own headquarters in Bahrain, within theoretical strike range. This is not to say China intends to strike any of these targets. The strategic logic here is far more subtle and far more consequential than a shooting war. The logic is presence. The logic is ambiguity. The logic is making Washington calculate the cost of military action in ways it has never had to calculate before. Compare this to Russian naval capability in the region during the Syrian intervention of 2015 and 2016, when Moscow deployed a carrier task group through the eastern Mediterranean that, while operationally limited by the poor performance of the Admiral Kuznetsov, nonetheless forced the United States and NATO to build a second chessboard into every contingency plan. China is attempting a similar move at a far more strategically sensitive location with significantly more capable hardware. Now we need to pull back to the widest possible frame and ask the question that intelligence analysts in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Tehran are all asking simultaneously: why now? The timing of this deployment does not exist in a vacuum. It intersects with at least 4 major strategic developments that have been converging for the past 6 to 18 months, and understanding each one is essential to understanding why Chinese warships are moving toward Hormuz at this specific moment. The first is the ongoing reconstruction of the China-Iran strategic partnership under what Beijing and Tehran describe as the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, the 25-year cooperation agreement signed in March 2021, that committed China to an estimated $400 billion in Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, energy, and defense sectors in exchange for a guaranteed discounted oil supply. According to Dr. Ariane Tabatabai, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and the author of multiple studies on Iranian strategic culture at the Rand Corporation, Iran views this partnership not merely as economic relief from sanctions pressure, but as a strategic validation, a great power endorsing Tehran's role as a regional actor deserving of respect. A Chinese naval presence near Hormuz, even a temporary one, dramatically reinforces that political signal. The second development is the intelligence assessment, reported by the Wall Street Journal in late 2024 and confirmed by sources cited in Foreign Policy, that Iran's nuclear program has achieved sufficient technical progress that the window for effective military interdiction is narrowing. When that window narrows, American or Israeli military planners begin updating their operational timelines. And when that happens, China has an interest in ensuring that any strike on Iran carries visible strategic costs that were not previously part of the calculation. The third factor is the Houthi interdiction campaign in the Red Sea, which since late 2023 has disrupted approximately 40% of container shipping traffic through the Suez Canal corridor, according to data compiled by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and reported by Bloomberg. China, whose Belt and Road Initiative depends critically on the stability of this maritime corridor, has watched American and European naval efforts to suppress Houthi missile and drone attacks achieve only partial success. Beijing has publicly called for diplomatic solutions while privately calculating that America's inability to fully restore freedom of navigation reveals a gap between U.S. military dominance and U.S. strategic control of the region, a gap China may be positioning to exploit. The fourth and arguably most immediately relevant factor is Taiwan. According to Dr. Michael Beckley, Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and co-author of Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China, every move China makes in the Indian Ocean and Middle East theater needs to be read against the Taiwan backdrop. Beijing is systematically probing the bandwidth of American strategic attention and military response capacity, looking for the moment when Washington is too committed elsewhere to reinforce Taipei credibly. A Chinese naval presence near Hormuz does not require firing a single shot to create strategic value for Beijing. It simply needs to exist, to be acknowledged, and to force American planners to hold assets in the Gulf that might otherwise be available in the Pacific. The historical precedent here is instructive. In October 1962, the Soviet deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba was not a plan for nuclear war. It was a calculated move to shift the strategic balance, gain leverage in Berlin and elsewhere, and force the Kennedy administration to negotiate from a position of perceived disadvantage. Nikita Khrushchev gambled that the psychological impact of missiles 90 miles from Florida would translate into geopolitical concessions elsewhere. He was wrong about Kennedy's willingness to accept that, but he was absolutely correct about the strategic logic of using forward deployment as a negotiating instrument. China in 2025 is not the Soviet Union in 1962. It is more economically integrated with its adversaries, more diplomatically cautious, and significantly more sophisticated in its use of ambiguity as a strategic tool. But the underlying logic, establish presence, create costs, extract leverage, is recognizably similar. Tehran's perspective on this development is complex, and it would be a mistake to assume that Iran simply welcomes Chinese warships in its neighborhood without reservation. According to analysis published by the Middle East Institute and attributed to Dr. Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran program, Iran has a deep historical suspicion of great power interference in its affairs that predates the Islamic Republic. The memory of British and Russian competition for influence in Iran in the 19th and 20th centuries is not forgotten. A Chinese naval presence near Hormuz is welcome insofar as it constrains American freedom of action. It is less welcome if it begins to signal that Iran's strategic autonomy is being substituted for one patron's protection rather than enhanced through genuine multipolarity. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, are reading this situation with their own distinct anxieties. Riyadh, in particular, has invested enormously in its diplomatic relationship with Beijing, which brokered the Saudi-Iran rapprochement of March 2023 in a move that genuinely surprised Washington. According to reporting by The Economist, senior Saudi officials have privately described China as a more reliable partner than the United States, not because Beijing offers the same security guarantees, but because China makes no demands about human rights, democratic governance, or weapons proliferation norms. A Chinese naval presence near Hormuz could be interpreted as Beijing extending its protective umbrella over the entire Gulf region, an interpretation that would simultaneously delight and terrify Riyadh, depending on the day and the threat being contemplated. And in Washington, the response to this deployment has so far been one of studied public ambiguity combined with intensive private activity. The Pentagon, according to 3 defense officials cited on Background by Politico, has convened an interagency working group to assess the deployment's implications. The National Security Council is reportedly engaged, and the commander of U.S. Central Command has reportedly requested updated intelligence products on Chinese naval intentions in the region on an accelerated timeline. What Washington has not done, notably, is publicly demand that China explain or reverse this deployment, and that silence is itself strategic information. It suggests that American policymakers are not yet certain whether this deployment represents a permanent shift in Chinese power projection posture or a temporary message-sending exercise. Certainty, once achieved, would require a response. Uncertainty can be managed quietly, for a while. So where does this situation go from here? Let's model the three most plausible scenarios with the probability assessments that current evidence supports. The first scenario, call it diplomatic de-escalation, carries a probability of approximately 30 to 35%. In this scenario, China completes its demonstration deployment. The formation conducts what it describes as scheduled exercises in the northern Arabian Sea or Gulf of Oman, and then returns to the Indian Ocean on a course back toward the South China Sea. Beijing pockets the strategic message, "We can be here, plan accordingly," without committing to permanent presence. The United States privately registers its concern through military-to-military channels. Some form of reassurance dialogue occurs, and the deployment becomes a data point in the ongoing calibration of great power competition rather than a crisis inflection. This scenario is most likely if Beijing determines that the diplomatic costs of escalating anxiety in the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, whose sovereign wealth funds and energy contracts are deeply intertwined with Chinese economic interests, outweigh the strategic benefits of extended presence. The second scenario, permanent or semi-permanent presence establishment, carries a probability of approximately 40 to 45% and represents the most strategically significant outcome. In this scenario, China uses this deployment as the foundation for a regularized rotational naval presence in the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea, potentially including periodic transits through the Strait of Hormuz itself. This would not require establishing a new base. China already operates a logistics support facility in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, its first acknowledged overseas military installation, and the infrastructure for extended Indian Ocean operations is already partially in place. A regularized presence would force a permanent recalculation of American operational planning in the Gulf, provide Iran with ongoing implicit deterrent coverage, and establish China as a genuine stakeholder in Gulf security architecture for the first time in history. This scenario becomes more probable if the deployment proceeds without significant pushback from Gulf Arab states and if Beijing calculates that the Taiwan Strait situation is stable enough to sustain multi-theater attention. The third scenario, crisis escalation, carries a probability of approximately 20 to 25%, and represents the highest consequence outcome. In this scenario, the Chinese deployment coincides with, or precipitates, a significant escalation in regional tensions, most plausibly either an Israeli or American military strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, or a major Houthi attack that kills American service members and triggers a large-scale U.S. military response in Yemen. In that environment, Chinese vessels near Hormuz are no longer a strategic abstraction. They are physical actors in a crisis whose rules of engagement have not been negotiated and whose communication channels between Chinese and American naval commanders in the region are, according to multiple experts, including Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn of the Center for a New American Security, inadequate for the pace of decision-making that a real-time crisis would demand. The risk of miscalculation, a Chinese vessel responding to what it perceives as a threatening American maneuver, or vice versa, becomes acute. This scenario is most likely if Israeli military planning for a strike on Iran, which multiple sources indicate is in advanced stages, reaches execution phase while Chinese vessels are within range of the conflict zone. In the next 24 to 72 hours, there are 5 specific indicators that will tell us which of these scenarios is materializing. Watch for official Chinese Foreign Ministry statements about the deployment. If Beijing begins acknowledging it publicly and framing it in terms of legitimate freedom of navigation and regional stability that suggests confidence in the permanent presence scenario. Watch for U.S. Fifth Fleet communications about increased naval patrols or repositioning of carrier assets. Any movement of a carrier strike group toward the Gulf of Oman would indicate Washington is moving from managed ambiguity to visible deterrence posture. Watch for statements from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. If Gulf Arab capitals stay silent, they are tacitly accepting the new reality. If they express concern through diplomatic channels, that creates pressure on Beijing to walk back. Watch for Iranian state media. IRNA and Press TV will signal Tehran's interpretation, and if they begin describing the deployment in celebratory terms as evidence of Iran's international support, Beijing will need to decide whether that framing serves or undermines its interests. And watch for the Dongpinghu's position. If the replenishment vessel moves toward Djibouti rather than back toward the South China Sea, it is pre-positioning logistics for extended operations. What we are watching unfold in the Arabian Sea right now is not simply a naval deployment. It is a stress test of the entire architecture of American military dominance in the Middle East. An architecture built over 5 decades, reinforced through 4 major regional wars, and never before challenged by a peer competitor with the economic weight, technological capacity, and strategic patience that China brings to this moment. The Strait of Hormuz handles approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Any disruption to that flow, from military conflict, from miscalculation, from the kind of spiraling crisis that great power competitions occasionally produce, would send oil prices past $200 per barrel within days, according to Goldman Sachs energy analysts, triggering a global recession whose consequences would fall hardest on the developing economies of Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The stakes here are not abstract geopolitical calculations. They are fuel prices, food prices, and the economic stability of billions of people who will never appear in these satellite images. The question this channel will be tracking in real time is not just what China does next. It is whether the diplomatic and military frameworks that the international community has relied on to manage great power competition in the Gulf are adequate for a world in which China is now a genuine naval actor in every ocean on Earth. If you want to understand this situation at the depth it deserves, before the mainstream media packages it into 2-minute segments stripped of every technical and strategic detail that actually matters, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. We cover these developments in the framework that allows you to actually understand them, not just react to them. When the next move happens, and there will be a next move, you will have the analytical foundation to interpret it immediately. Before you go, I want to leave you with 3 questions worth sitting with, and I want you to take them into the comments and tell me what you think. First, does China's deployment near Hormuz represent a fundamental strategic shift toward permanent multi-theater power projection, or is this a calibrated demonstration that Beijing intends to walk back once it has registered its message? Second, how should the United States respond to Chinese naval presence in the Gulf in a way that deters escalation without triggering the very crisis it seeks to prevent? And does the Biden or any subsequent administration have the strategic communication capacity to thread that needle? Third, and most consequentially, if an Israeli or American strike on Iranian nuclear facilities occurs while Chinese warships are in the region, what is the realistic pathway to preventing that from becoming a direct U.S.-China military incident? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the precise questions that policymakers in Washington, Beijing, Tel Aviv, and Tehran are wrestling with right now in real time, with incomplete information and enormous stakes. The answers will determine what kind of world we live in for the next generation.